to you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Okay, all right. I think that should be up,
Yep, looks great.
right? Okay, great. Awesome. All right. Yeah, thanks, Tony, and thanks to the MWA Webinar Committee for the invitation and opportunity to talk about rare turtle conservation in Michigan today. So we're just going to jump right in. So turtles and tortoises have been on Earth for over 200 million years, but somehow now they are one of the most threatened vertebrate groups on the planet. So Rodin et al. From 2018, they found that 52% of the world's 360 turtle and tortoise species are considered threatened, endangered, critically endangered, or extinct based on the IUCN's Red List criteria. And the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And the photos here show some of these some of the world's most threatened turtle and tortoise species. And turtles and tortoises in the US and Michigan also are in conservation trouble. 40% of the 57 turtle species that are native to the US are listed as endangered or threatened. And similarly, 40% of Michigan's native turtles are considered rare and or declining. So today we're going to talk about Michigan's rare and declining turtle species. We're going to start with a brief overview of Michigan's turtle species in general, and then we're going to focus on the rare turtles. We're going to talk about their status, life history, and ecology, especially their habitat needs and when and where we can find them. We'll also talk about the threats that these rare turtle species are facing that have resulted in their decline, and some of the conservation efforts that MNFI and other partners in Michigan have been doing to try to address and reduce some of these threats. We'll also talk a little bit about the project review and permitting requirements for these species, and then we'll end up with what you can do if you happen to find one of these cool rare turtles and what you can do to help conserve them. So in Michigan, we have 9 or 10 native turtle species, and I'll explain why I say 9 or 10 in a minute. 6 of them are shown here. These are the species that are considered common or doing better in Michigan. So these include the eastern snapping turtle, the eastern musk turtle, which is also has been identified as a species of greatest conservation need in Michigan State Wildlife Action Plan, painted turtle, northern map turtle, eastern spiny softshell, and the red-eared slider. And the red-eared slider has a little asterisk next to its name because there's still some question about whether this species is actually native to Michigan or not. So these species are largely aquatic. Snapping turtles, musk turtles, painted turtles, and red-eared sliders are mostly found in ponds, lakes, reservoirs, swamps, marshes, and slow-moving streams and rivers. Basically, any permanent water body with ample aquatic vegetation and basking sites. Map turtles and eastern spiny softshell turtles are mainly found in large rivers and streams they tend to be able to occur in areas with faster currents. Painted turtles can also occur in these areas, and as well as larger inland lakes, reservoirs, and protected bays and river mouths of the Great Lakes. And then these are the 4 species in Michigan that are rare and or declining. So these are the Blandings turtle, which is listed as a special concern species in Michigan, the spotted turtle, which is state threatened, the wood turtle, which is also state threatened, and the eastern box turtle, which was just upgraded to state threatened last year. Or actually, yeah, I think last year, the year before. All 4 of these species also have been identified as species of greatest conservation need in Michigan's State Wildlife Action Plan. The Blandings turtle, spotted turtle, and wood turtle also have been petitioned for federal listing. The status assessments for these species have been completed, and we're just waiting to hear from the Fish and Wildlife Service if any of these 3 turtle species will be proposed for federal listing. Michigan Natural Features Inventory, MNFI, we've conducted surveys and compiled information from external sources on these species, on these rare species for over 30 years to assess and monitor their status, distribution, ecology, and conservation needs. And in the last 6 years or so, we've been able to conduct more focused surveys, monitoring, and research on the blanding, spotted, and wood turtle populations in the state, thanks to some federal funding and funding from the Michigan DNR. So today I'm going to focus the talk on the blanding spotted and wood turtles, but I'll also briefly talk about the box turtle as well. So just to before we jump into talking about those species, I wanted to just kind of provide a quick kind of overview about turtles. So like a turtle overview 101. So that'll make it easier for when we start talking about the actual rare species then. So I wanted to start off talking about turtle shell morphology, because that's definitely, one of the key ways to identify these species. So a turtle has, a shell on the top and a shell on the bottom, right? And so the shell on the top is called the carapace, and the shell on the bottom is called the plastron. And all those scales that make up the shell, the carapace and the plastron, those are called scutes. And some of those scutes actually have specific names, but we don't need to worry about that for today. Just some fun factoids, and if you happen to encounter one of these rare turtles, a couple things you can do if you pick it up and take a look at the shell. So one thing is that you can actually count those growth rings on the scutes, are called annuli, and like that's shown on the plastron here on these two pictures. And you can actually age a turtle. Just like you can age a tree from the growth rings, up to about 20 or 25 years or so. And then the lines get too close together to really count accurately. You can also tell the sex of a turtle based on the shape of the plastron. So if it's concave or curved in, it's a male. And then females, on the other hand, so like the male on the shown on the photo on the left, that is curved in, so that's a male. And then the photo on the right is a female, and you can see that the female has a very flat plastron. Males also have longer tails with the vent um, at or extending past the edge of the plastron. You can also see some differences in the pattern of the blotching, the black blotching on the plastron. And so that actually will vary from individual to individual. So it's like a fingerprint. So you can actually identify an individual turtle based on the markings of the plastron, at least for some turtle species. The other thing I also wanted to quick go over was about turtle life history, especially its annual life history. So in Michigan and the US, turtles are generally active from April through October. And during the active season, the turtles are foraging, so they're looking for food. They're thermoregulating or regulating their body temperature as, ectotherms, by either basking on a log in the sun to warm up when it's cool, or they're hiding under cover or burrowing into the leaf litter soil um, during the summer when it's really hot if they're on land, or they're staying or going back into the water when it's hot, or also when it's cold or cool as well. They typically will mate in the spring, but some species can also mate in the fall. And they're also dispersing to new areas if needed and migrating between different habitats during the active season. There are two other critical components of their life history are nesting and hatchling emergence. So that's when the little turtles hatch out of the eggs. So they typically nest on land in June, but can start in late May and nest until early to mid-July. And the hatchlings usually emerge in late August through September and even into October during years when we have cooler summers. The rest of the year, from November through March, turtles are typically overwintering underwater, buried in the substrate, or in or under log jams, or you know, um, in or under the banks along the edge of water bodies. Then. All right, so let's talk about the rare species then. So starting with the Blanding's turtle, Emidoidea blandingi. So this species, you can identify it from the carapace is very high domed, really tall compared to other turtle species. And it's also usually like brown color or black with yellow spots or flecking or streaks on it. And it's a fairly large turtle compared to other turtles. The length of the carapace about 6 to 11 inches. And then the plastron, as you can see on the photo there on the right, has a dark blotch at the outer edge of the scutes then. And the landing turtle plastron also has a hinge, which allows it to close up especially the front portion of the plastron and the shell so that it can protect it from predators. Um, the very obvious characteristic for identifying Bland's turtle is the really bright yellow neck, which you can see really clearly. And then if you look from the side of the face, you can see it looks like it's smiling. So that's one of my favorite turtles. The map shows the distribution of landing turtles in Michigan. So it pretty much occurs throughout the Lower Peninsula and also in parts of the UP. So if there could be a turtle poster child for wetlands, it would be the Blandings turtle. It spends most of its time in wetlands and water bodies, especially shallow wetlands, often with submergent vegetation and soft organic bottoms. This species uses a variety of wetlands and water bodies, including shrub swamps, floodplain forests, and vernal pools that are shown in the slide. Really likes those button bush depressions, button bush swamps, but it also can be found in marshes, fens, bogs, um, other forested swamps, the edges of permanent ponds, and also slow-moving rivers and streams. They also can use semi-natural wetlands like the diked wetland that's shown up in the upper right photo. Landings turtles also tend to often will use multiple wetlands. So they'll move between different wetlands during the active season then. So they might use like a vernal pool in the spring, and then when that dries up, they'll move to, other bodies of water that still have water, or larger bodies of water. Um, some individual turtles in some populations can use as many as 6 to 20 wetlands per year on average. Um, and so areas with complexes of wetlands, especially with different types of wetlands, especially the wetlands that, have different hydro periods, would be, really beneficial for this species. They use these wetlands during the active season for foraging, for thermal regulation, mating, and then they also overwinter in wetlands as well. And where they bury themselves in the bottoms of the wetlands or the water bodies. So it's really important to make sure that the wetlands in which these species, in which this species is overwintering in, stay flooded throughout the winter. Otherwise, the turtles could freeze and die. And they have a lot of site fidelity to these wetlands, so they tend to use the same wetlands year after year and throughout the active season. They also will use upland habitat for nesting. So these really open, sunny upland areas with, well-drained soils like sandy, gravelly, loamy soil and with little to no vegetation. So that's a little Blandings turtle there laying eggs and nesting. Um, they'll sometimes nest pretty close to a wetland, but a lot of times they actually tend to move pretty far. They can move over a mile away from a wetland then to look for suitable nesting habitat. And again, there's a lot of site fidelity, so they tend to go back to the same areas to nest year after year. And one of the interesting things about Blandings turtles, and actually a lot of our turtles, or most of our turtles, is that they have temperature-dependent sex determination of their young. And so depending on the temperature that the eggs are being incubated in, cooler temperatures tend to produce males, and then warmer temperatures tend to produce females. Okay, so moving on to the spotted turtle, Chlamys guttata. So this is a little turtle. It's only about 3.5 to 5.5 inches long then. And the carapace tends to usually be smooth and black with small round yellow spots. And the plastron usually has black spots, but you can see from the photo shown here that highly variable in terms of the patterning with the spots on the carapace and the blotching on the plastron. So there's a lot of variability in the patterning for this turtle species. And then this turtle does not have a hinge on the plastron, so it can't close up like the Blandings turtle can. And the chin color for the males tends to be tan, brown, or black, and for the females, they tend to be yellow or orange. And you can see from the distribution map there, they primarily occur in southern Michigan, and then they kind of go up the coast up to up to northern lower, with some inland populations then in the northern lower as well. This species also obviously is very closely associated with wetland habitats, particularly shallow wetlands. They tend to use wetlands that have little lower, shallower water than the Blandings turtle, although the two species can often occur in the same wetland habitats. So the wetlands that the spotted turtles will use often have, slow or standing but very shallow water that can be either temporarily or permanently flooded. The wetlands usually will have like soft, mucky bottoms with a lot of aquatic and emergent vegetation. And they can use a variety of wetlands. A lot of times they'll use fens or bogs, marshes, wet meadows, and prairies. They also will use vernal pools quite a bit in the spring. And then they also can use small streams and ditches. Actually, in some parts of Michigan and Ohio, a lot of times you'll find spotted turtles in ditches. And in some populations, spotted turtles also will use multiple wetlands, or with individuals using up to 9 different wetlands. And for nesting habitat, so spotted turtles tend to not move as much, especially compared to like the Blanding's turtle. So they have very small home ranges. In some, like 1 to 9 acres. In some populations, the spotted turtles can move further than, but so in some cases they will move to adjacent upland areas, open sunny, upland areas to nest. But a lot of times spotted turtles will just nest right in the wetlands that they occur in. So right in the like in the sphagnum hummocks in the wetlands or under rotting logs or something like that then. And that's so it's pretty interesting, pretty different than other turtle species in Michigan. And they also have temperature dependent sex determination. Okay, moving on to the wood turtle, Leptemis insculpta. So wood turtle, the carapace tends to be, very low, and it tends to have this kind of raised ridges where there's like a raised ridge along the center line, or they call the keel, the central keel. And then each of those scutes also tends to kind of be ridged and raised up in the middle, so it forms like a little pyramid. When you can see the growth rings on each scute pretty clearly. The adult length's about 6 to 10 inches. The plastron also has a black blotch at the outer edge of the scutes usually, and this species also it does not have a hinge on the plastron. A lot of times the neck and the limbs and the feet can be really orange, but also they can be reddish color or yellow. And you can see from the distribution map, this species tends to occur primarily in northern Michigan, so in the northern lower half of the state, and also in the Upper Peninsula. And this species is a riverine species then. So it is primarily occurs in small to medium-sized rivers and streams. And especially during certain times of the year, they're almost always in the water then in the river and the stream, and especially in late fall, winter, and early spring. That's where they overwinter and mate. And then during a lot of the active season, like starting in late spring to early fall, especially in the summertime, a lot of times they're actually in the adjacent upland or wetland habitats then. So they tend to be a little more terrestrial than some of our other turtle species in Michigan. Uh, they tend to use streams and rivers that have slow to moderate flow with sandy or gravelly or cobbly kind of substrates. Um, and a lot of times it's forested. They need forest habitat or forested landscape along the rivers, but they also will use these early successional, more like openings or edge kind of habitats along the river as well. And they overwinter in the stream and river under log jams or woody debris piles, or there's like a overhanging tree root, overhanging banks, or just right on the stream bottom then. And again, they show a lot of site fidelity. So you'll find them in the same places in the river from, year to year, pretty much. And then they also will use, the adjacent, like I mentioned, the adjacent wetlands and upland habitats. So especially in late spring, summer, and early fall, they move out of the river and they'll go back and forth between the adjacent wetlands and uplands and then back into the river. And then during the summer, especially, they'll move a little further away. And a lot of times they'll just kind of hunker down and estivate and spend a lot of the summer actually on land. In terms of wetlands that they'll use along, adjacent to the river, they'll use, forest swamps, some of the alder swamp areas, wet meadows. And then for kind of the upland areas, especially open areas, sort of like old fields or grassy openings that are adjacent to forests. And they're primarily found they tend to generally be found, occur even when they're on land, they tend to be within about 2/10 of a mile or about 300 meters from the river. They tend to stay pretty, pretty close to the river. And then in terms of nesting, they're going to be nesting on like open upland sandy banks right along the river there. But they also can move inland and nest in upland habitats there, can be up to almost half a mile away from the river then. And again, just so you can see this pattern, just like the other species, they exhibit a lot of site fidelity where they're, nesting in the same areas year after year, usually. Um, wood turtles and only one of few turtle species that actually have genetic sex determination of their young. And so they're not, temperature dependent then. So that's pretty interesting. And then just real quick, eastern box turtle. This is Michigan's only truly terrestrial turtle. The carapace is pretty domed. It's really pretty. It's like brown or black, but it's got this, really cool patterning with yellow and orange kind of streaks or blotches or lines on the scutes. The adults tend to be about 5 to 8 inches long in terms of the shell. And then the plastron, is usually this either light tan or black or brown color with streaks or blotches. And the box turtle has a hinge. And so a lot of times, yeah, you might have, if you picked up a box turtle, you'll see that it can actually, totally close up to protect from predators. And it's pretty strong, that hinge close up, because don't stick your finger in there, because I've done that and that was a big mistake. So um box turtles in Michigan occur primarily in southern Michigan, and then again they kind of follow the same pattern like the spotted turtles, where they kind of go up more the west side of the state into the northern lower then. So and then box turtle habitat, they are, again, our terrestrial species, so they occur primarily in deciduous or mixed upland forests. They also can use early successional habitats, including grasslands and some of the younger forests or old fields, pastures, lawns, power line right-of-ways. Um, they use those areas, for foraging and for nesting, and especially for nesting, they'll look for places that have the really open, well-drained, loose soils that, especially if it's south or east facing, with a lot of sun exposure. And for box turtles, even though they're a terrestrial species, the access to water is still really critical for them. And so they will use, wetlands, like shallow, emergent wetlands or forested swamps, or the edges of ponds and bogs and slow-moving streams and rivers during the summer, especially when it, gets hotter. They'll go into sort of the water or these wetter areas to stay cool. And in the winter, they're actually overwintering in the upland forest. They just kind of hunker down under the leaf litter, or kind of burrow themselves into the soil. They can go pretty deep. They can actually go down to almost 2 feet deep below the surface. Or they might find like a little hole somewhere, a tree stump hole, or a mammal burrow, or little tree root, opening or something, and then just kind of squeeze themselves in there. One of the interesting things about box turtles is that they can actually tolerate sub-freezing temperatures, so they can actually partially freeze. 50 to 60% of the water in their body can actually freeze, and they can still survive. So that's pretty cool. And again, of course, just like the other species, a lot of site fidelity. They tend to return to the same site to overwinter each year, and also the same places to like nest and everything each year. So you can see how it's really important that, the places where these species are using is really important to try to maintain and protect them if we can. So we talked about how these species are declining, and so they face number of threats. One of the main threats is, just like a lot of our wildlife species, loss of habitat, habitat degradation and fragmentation. And this goes for both loss of wetlands, but also loss of like upland habitats that they need, and especially their upland nesting habitat. So either through outright, destruction, or succession, vegetative succession, or invasive species are, have now, vegetated a lot of these open sandy areas used to where they used to nest then. And a lot of times there might be roads that, separate their wetland and their upland habitat, or between different wetlands that they might move between, and that can result in road mortality, which can be a significant threat in some places. Predation of nests and also of the turtles, juvenile and adult turtles themselves by mesopredators like raccoons is a significant issue. Illegal collection for the pet trade or for food, especially for Asian markets, can be a really big issue and can really wipe a population out in some cases. Climate change, changing, if changing precipitation patterns, temperature patterns, for species that have temperature dependent sex determination, that can influence and change the sex ratio of the young then, and also the nesting success in some cases. So that can have a huge impact on species. Disease, a new disease was discovered in blanding turtles just a couple of years ago. It's a shell fungus, and with climate change, disease can become more of an issue. um, in some cases, limited management where we're not really managing habitat appropriately for blanding for turtles and for some of these rare species, or inappropriate management. So for some of these species, fire is a tool that we can use to help maintain the habitat, but timing of fire and how we conduct the fire can also potentially have adverse impacts on the species. And then finally, especially like in Michigan but in general, there's just not a lot of information about these species. We just haven't done a lot of work or research on, these species or targeted surveys throughout the state or monitoring compared to, some of the other wildlife species that we have in Michigan. And that makes it hard to manage them if we don't have good information. Um, these turtle species, the four rare species, also have life histories that make them even more vulnerable to these threats. So for one, these species have delayed sexual maturity. So for example, wood and blanding turtles might take anywhere from 12 to 20 years before they actually start reproducing. Spotted turtles, a little bit less, but still, can take quite a long time, before they actually start reproducing. And then when they actually start reproducing, it's pretty low annual reproduction. So Michigan, generally, these turtles only have one clutch of eggs a year, and they may not, actually nest every year. So you can see some of the numbers of the eggs per nest. And just for comparison, snapping turtle eggs or snapping turtle clutch sizes, they typically have 20 to 40 eggs each nest, each year. So, uh, and then even when they do nest, there's really high nest and juvenile mortality. So in some cases with nest predation, you can get even 100%, nest mortality or loss of nest then. So no nest making, being able to actually have hatchlings emerge in a given year. Um, and so, but they kind of compensate for this in the sense that because they're very long lived. So these species can actually live, 60, 70 years, in some cases even 100 years or more. That blanding turtle that's shown there, in the photo, the adult there, that's a female. I think that's like 90 years old. And it's, she's still reproducing. That's from a population that has been monitored in Michigan for over 40 years. So, so they kind of compensate for this by living a long time and being able to reproduce for a long time then. So for them, for these populations to be sustainable for the long term, they have to have really high adult survivorship, over 90% or even over 95% then, in order for these populations to be sustainable over time. And so, so what are some of these implications of having this life history? Is that they really have slow turtles. These species have really slow population growth, and then when they decline, it takes them a long time to actually recover from the decline. Then, so I think this graphic, I really like showing it because it does a good job, I think, of kind of showing what this means, especially compared to some of the other wildlife species that maybe we're a little more familiar with. And so you can see on the column there on the left, that snapping turtle, good, sort of representation for these rare species. It takes 17 years for a snapping turtle to lay its first clutch of eggs. And during that same time period of 17 years, the black bear is already, reproduced, and there's now 25 reproduced and had 25 young. Moose have had, 680 young, and then white-tailed deer produced over 900 young then. So you can see sort of, they have very different life strategies, and we have to manage them differently then because of that. Um, Another implication of this life history then, especially the long-lived nature of the species, is that the adults, can survive a long time. And so we can continue to see them on the landscape and think that the populations are doing okay when maybe they haven't been reproducing at all and there hasn't been any successful reproduction. So this graphic here is the representation from a female from an alligator snapping turtle, where 1987 was the last time that there was a successful reproduction, and we continue to see the turtles, the adults in the population until like 2002, but there hasn't been any successful reproduction going on, and so we think that the populations are doing fine, but actually they're not actually being sustained over time. They're not sustainable then. They're not viable. And so we can call this, or Jim Harding has called this, like ghost populations, or other people have called this the perception of persistence, where just because we see turtles in the landscape doesn't mean that the populations are doing okay. So in Michigan, we have documented, like in the Michigan Natural Heritage Database, a lot of populations, or what we call element occurrences, for these 3 species. But what if, we don't have good information about the status of these populations, or their abundance, or their demographics, or their condition, or the threats that are affecting them, or what if these populations are those ghost populations, and we just think that they're doing fine, but they're really just hanging on and until they blip out then. And so, and then if we want to do something, which populations need management, and what do they need, and where, and how? And so without, having information about the populations themselves on the landscape, it makes it really difficult to try to manage and conserve them then. So in the last, like I mentioned, last like 5 or 6 years or so, MNFI is working with the DNR and a number of other partners to try to implement some conservation efforts then, to help us get some information to start better understanding how these, how the populations of these rare turtle species in Michigan are doing, and then, to actually try to implement some of these management on the ground then. And so, so for wood turtles, for example, we've been doing population monitoring focusing on 3 river systems, where based on the Natural Heritage Database, we've had a lot of reports of wood turtles, so we think that they're pretty good populations. We use the standardized protocol that was developed by Brown et al. For use in other states in the Midwest. And we've never actually used the standardized protocol before. And so this is the first time that we were trying this out. And we actually captured, processed, and marked the wood turtle. So it's like a mark recapture study. And they were hoping to be able to get information about wood turtle abundance, their demographics, like their sex ratio, or the age structure of the population. Is there successful reproduction going on? So in terms of number of young, and then look at some of the threats and maybe identify them. What are some of the management needs and their potential viability? And so the surveys that we did were along the riverbanks, along these 1-kilometer transects, along both sides of the river, within 25 meters of the river. The protocol calls for 6 survey replicates per site, and it's best to do the surveys in the spring, so from mid-April to early June. And so in 2022 and 2023, we did almost like 160 surveys of 27 sites in each of those 2 years. And we're able to get some pretty good results. So the actual numbers here aren't, I think, as important as just the general trend. And so populations 1 and 2, we kind of combine them because they're sort of tributaries of the same river system. And population 3 was another river system then. And what was interesting was that we found a lot more turtles along in populations 1 and 2 than we did for population 3, even though we had a lot of wood turtle observations historically for population 3. And so again, this kind of points to, just because we see, and have observations and see turtles on the landscape does not necessarily mean that they're, really healthy or abundant populations then. But the good news is that in both years, of the 27 sites we surveyed, we found wood turtles in almost all, like over 80% of those sites then. So again, they're still on the landscape, but the question is, how are those populations actually doing? So we're working with Dr. Jennifer Moore and a grad student, Marianne Kelso at Grand Valley State University, who's been doing some abundance modeling, and then we're going to be able to produce some abundance estimates for each of these sites that are these 1 kilometer transects. And this will be the first time we'll actually have some abundance data, that's using a standardized protocol. And then we'll be able to use this information to be able to compare. We have to say, oh, looks like there's some sites that you can see from this graph that tend to have higher abundances than some of the other sites then. So we can focus our management and be able to and also be able to compare over time to see if we do management, how our management's doing, and be able to compare abundance across sites and then again over time then. So I'm pretty excited about that. We also, for wood turtles, have been doing some radiotelemetry and some surveys to try to identify where the turtles are nesting and how, if they have sufficient nesting habitat and the quality of the nesting habitat to see if there are places where maybe we could do some habitat restoration or creation for nesting habitat. And so we put some transmitters on some females at one of the populations. And what we found was that it seemed like nesting habitat might be really limited. So you can see from the photos on the right there were not a lot of places along the river that had sandy banks. They were very, small areas then and very steep. A lot of the areas also had a lot of vegetation that had grown in on them. And then with the telemetry, we saw that, a lot of our females that, tended to move to the same, few areas that actually had the sandy habitat along the bank for nesting. And they ended up moving then really far. So you can see on that's the graph, the photo on the lower left there, where we had, females moving 2 to 5 miles to move to nesting areas then. So that's a lot. That's really far for turtles to be able to move, and they can encounter a lot of, risks along the way. So one of the things that we
5 minutes.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that we've been doing is working on some conservation efforts where we have been trying to create some nesting habitat, working with the local land managers, and also we put like a nesting mound and then created this large nest enclosure that allows the turtles to be able to move in underneath it and they can nest, but predators can't get in then. So we haven't documented wood turtles using it yet, but we're hoping that, we can get some wood turtles to hopefully use it in the future. Um, and then in terms of spotted turtle surveys, same thing, population surveys and monitoring, where we're doing some trapping surveys, rapid assessment surveys, and long-term surveys at a number of sites, following a standard protocol developed by the Northeast. We're capturing and processing and marking turtles and collecting blood for genetic analysis. And this is work that was done by MNFI and also a number of other partners. And then for the population monitoring in 2022 and 2023, we found spotted turtles at about 60% of the sites. So quite, not, that's about over a little over half. But what wasn't, so they're still there, but what we're finding is that a lot of the sites we only found, a handful of turtles then. But then there are, there would all of a sudden be like a small handful of sites where we find a lot more turtles. So that was encouraging. And then we, did find some juveniles and hatchlings, but only at a small number of sites. The genetic analysis also seemed to support that these populations may be really small and isolated. So there's some evidence of inbreeding at a couple of the populations and also some really small effective population sizes then. So they may not be viable over the long term. In this past year, though, we did find a couple of sites where we found a lot of turtles with the demographic surveys, the long-term surveys, including juveniles and hatchlings. So we're pretty excited about being able to find what seems like pretty, robust, healthy populations. For Blanding's turtles, similar rapid assessment surveys, some long-term monitoring sites then at a couple of the sites, using, again, a standardized protocol, doing mark recapture surveys, collecting blood for genetic analysis. And the surveys this time was from 2019 to 2023. Again, finding Blanding's turtles at a number of sites, 73% of the sites that we surveyed. But at a lot of those sites, or most of those sites, we found or documented less than 10 individuals. And also, we only documented juveniles at less than half of the sites that we found turtles. And only about 20% of the individuals that we captured were juveniles then. So it seems to, support that we're not seeing a lot of reproduction going on. But there was one site in the northern lower where we found a lot of turtles, including a lot of juveniles. So really excited to be able to find, that seems like a pretty good population. We also did some telemetry of females to see where they were nesting and habitat use, looking at habitat use. And the females, at least in this population, did not move much. They seemed to use the same one or two wetlands for most of the active season and also for the inactive season for overwintering. And the only time they really moved was during the nesting season. And some of these females moved really long distances, like a mile to get to nesting habitat. They use really what I would consider poor nesting habitat. So campgrounds, ag fields, the side of someone's garden in someone's yard. And so I think that seems to indicate that there's limited nesting habitat. And we also did protect some nests. And so even though with protecting nests, sometimes you can have fairly low hatching success. But this past year, we did get pretty good hatching success with the protected nest. And so maybe that's just, variability from year to year. And so for conservation, we're hoping to, protect more wetland habitats and complexes, especially those sites with greater abundance, protecting and enhancing existing habitats. So those ag fields and equestrian staging areas, what can we do to try to improve those conditions there and also try to maintain some sandy conditions there? Create additional nesting habitat near occupied wetlands. We want to be able to try to continue population surveys and monitoring and the nesting surveys and nest protection. And then we have a new project starting up. We're actually going to be piloting head starting and developing a framework for doing this so that we can maybe replicate it at other sites if we can show that head starting is an effective conservation tool. So I just have a couple more slides. Excuse me, a couple more slides here. Just wanted to go quick over project review and permitting. So if you're doing a project that needs a permit from EGLE, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, these 4 turtle species are currently not federal listed. So the project review and permitting process would follow the usual process that EGLE would take for screening and reviewing projects. So they would screen the permit application to assess if these species might be present, and then if there's any potential impacts to these species, just like they would with other TNE and special concern species or rare natural communities. EGLE would coordinate with other agencies, including the DNR, not necessarily Fish and Wildlife Service in this case, unless these species become federal listed, and MNFI to determine if a permit can be issued, and then if it can, what conditions might need to be included in the permit. And then they can deny applications that if it looks like there's going to be adverse impacts to these species then or their habitat, and or you could adjust the project to try to avoid those adverse impacts then. If there's a project or if you need a permit that doesn't need an EGLE permit, if you're doing something that doesn't need an EGLE permit, then you could get a permit from the DNR for the species that are listed as threatened. You would need a permit from the Wildlife Division. Oh, and it should say Wildlife Division and Fisheries Division. And then for special concern species like the Blanding's turtle, there is a special DNR director's order that prevents or prohibits take of special concern amphibians and reptiles. So you would need a permit from Fisheries Division for that. And then finally, what you can do to help. So if you do find one of these rare species, it would be great if you can report the observations to MNFI so we can put it into the Natural Heritage Database so we can continue to track and monitor these species status and distribution in the state and be able to identify the populations that we need to manage and protect. We have a rare species form, or Survey 123 form. That's the QR code there for it. If you would like to it'd be great if you could use that form. If you identify, the wetlands and aquatic habitats where these species are using, making sure to try to protect them, and especially for maintaining or restoring the hydrology, especially during the winter. And we talked about how these species, tend to use these same areas year after year. Trying to enhance or create additional nesting habitat, especially near occupied wetlands. So maybe they don't have to cross roads to get to suitable nesting habitat. If you find these turtles are nesting, if you can find some way to protect the nests, from predators, that would be helpful. Just make sure to remove whatever cage you put over it before um, the hatchlings get out before when they emerge. If there's an opportunity where you see that there might be some road mortality, there's an opportunity to try to reduce the road mortality, so that we can, again, that really important for adult survival. And so being able to reduce road mortality is really important for long-term population viability. And then if you can consider predator control, in, if you have the ability to think about that in some places, that would also be super helpful. So just for a quick acknowledge, we've had a lot of the work that we've talked about today. A lot of different funders and partners have contributed to make that work be able to, so we could do that work. And then we've had a whole army of field assistants and partners that have helped with all the field surveys and everything. So we couldn't have done it without all of them. So I really appreciate all their help. And that's it. And so hopefully we have some time for questions.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much for that presentation. And what an adorable photo shown here. It's too funny. Okay, so I'll just run through some of the questions that have been sent in. So the first, are the populations of Michigan turtles seeing changing sex ratios because of climate warming?
Yeah, I mean that's a good, that is a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't think we have the data yet, so there's really prior to about 5 years ago, there really was very limited work that's been done in terms of monitoring and looking at the demographics of the population. So I was looking at the data that we had from some of our surveys, and it was a little bit uneven, but it wasn't always consistently
Mm.
one way or another. So, in some years it 1 year it was more, or some sites it was more, females versus males, and then it was the other way around. So I don't know that we have enough data right now to be able to really say that, there's some concrete direction that things are moving.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Next question. Do you know of any studies on how dam removal affects wood turtle populations and habitat?
That is a good question. I am not familiar off the top of my head with studies that have looked at dam removal. But I would say that, you know, anything that could help restore the hydrology of these rivers so that, we can have that meandering and be able to create, additional nesting habitat potentially by restoring the hydrology of the rivers, I think in the long run would be beneficial for the species. But off the top of my head, I can look that up, but I can't think of an actual study that's looked at that.
Okay. Sure. Next question. Is the visual rapid assessment protocol used by MNFI available online?
So we use the protocols that have been developed by the Northeast Blanding Turtle Working Group and the Northeast Spotted Turtle Working Group. So it's available online if you look up, the Northeast, the
Okay,
Blanding Turtle and Spotted Turtle Working Groups.
gotcha. This question is touching on site fidelity.
Hmm.
The person wants to know, or would building new ponds or moving turtles to new locations to bolster genetics, would either of those be viable options for conservation in light of their site fidelity, or are those things just not helpful?
No, I mean, I think we are realizing that we need to do more of that. Like, we talked about with the evidence of inbreeding and, population isolation because of habitat loss and fragmentation. So I think things like translocation and being able to move some turtles or, head starting and try to introduce more genetic diversity into populations is something we're going to have to do more, I think, do more of in the future. And so there has been some studies that have shown some success. With with moving turtles. So things like they have something called hard release or soft release. So if you hard release, you just take a turtle, plop it in a new place, that turtle will want to go back. to where it came from, and then that's when, it's gonna encounter roads or predators or whatever and potentially face mortality. But if you do a soft release where you kind of pen the turtle into an area, the new location and kind of hold it there for some period of time before you let it start to explore, then it kind of keys in or gets used acclimated to that site, and then it doesn't do that, rapid movement to try to move back to where it came from. So, and then some folks have been experimenting in the Northeast with, I think the Northeast or the Southeast, with box turtles, releasing turtles that have been confiscated, and held in captivity. And what they do is they'll kind of do like it's sort of like a soft release, but instead of actually building a fence or a pen or something, they just, if it's a site that's really close to where they can go out and find that turtle, if the turtle starts to wander too far, they'll pick it up and move it back to where, where they want it to
Mm.
stay for some period of time. And so, so I think that, we are seeing there are some ways that you can kind of retrain them, to use new areas.
Okay. Here's a good question. Are regular citizens allowed to protect nest of these rare and threatened or endangered species, or legally are you not allowed to do that?
Um, Boy, that is a good question. I um I think that you can, as long as you don't disturb the nest and then just make sure to remove the whatever the cage is, before the hatchlings, emerge then. So but that's something that is probably worth checking into. Um,
I can chime in
yeah.
real quick
Okay.
on that. So I work for the DNR in the program that does rare species stuff. This is something we would want you to reach out to us about. So you can either contact myself, Amy Bleich, or Jennifer Kleitch with the DNR. If you just look up wild DNR wildlife threatened and endangered species, there should be a contact info. And we would usually probably say don't touch the nest at all. Don't do anything. And if it's in danger of being destroyed either through an activity or something, then we'll need to talk a bit more about what needs to be done.
Good. Thank you very much for that
Hmm.
input. Okay. Next question. So, are the field surveys something folks can volunteer to assist with?
Yeah, I mean, if you can reach out to, yeah, reach out to us, and then we can chat, and then go from there. So it's certainly for some of the surveys, it is helpful to have some extra eyes, especially like if you don't mind being out at night for nesting surveys, we would love to have more people
Mm.
out there helping us.
That sounds like a good time. And it
Yeah.
looks like your email address is on the slide right now if anybody wanted to contact you about that. Um, do we have an idea when ESA listings will be decided?
Yeah, everyone's been asking that, and it was supposed to come out, I think, last year, 'cause, the status assessments were done, and they had made, I think, some recommendations to the higher ups. But I don't know, and especially I think with the change in the administration, not really sure. They seem to, the what I've, at least for the person who was doing the wood turtle, she did not have any good information on the timeline. So
Okay. Okay. So moving on here, we're running short on time, so I'll try to go through the questions as fast as possible. There is a nature preserve in Southwest Michigan, a new one, that has a surprising number of box turtles. Well, sounds like we should use Survey 123 to report those. Um, Anyhow, they're trying to think about ways to conserve that population and wondering if building a nesting site like the one showed in your slides would make sense. And then, thinking about site fidelity, if they were to find a turtle to poor quality location, crossing into a highway, median, such, um, should should they leave them alone or move them to higher quality areas? And Tony, maybe you want to chime back in on
yeah.
this one too, because as far as threatened and endangered species go, you're generally not to touch them or handle them.
That is correct. So again, you would have to consult with the DNR to see, but the rule of thumb is you can help them cross like a road or something, but picking them up and actually moving them is not an allowed activity for those protected species.
And I would say in terms of like creating nesting mound, I mean, I think the QB to look to see, is nesting habitat a limiting factor? And then if that is the case, then, maybe, yeah, creating, or maybe there's some sandy area that you could just clear the vegetation, and that would work, just uh just as well. So it I think the key is always understanding, your population and having some information about, you know, where these turtles are going, what they're using, what areas are they using, because you want to make sure that you're creating an area or enhancing an area that turtles are actually going to be able to find and use, unless you need to move them, in which case, yeah, you'd have to contact the DNR then. So
Okay, so if they want to make these conservation efforts or adjustments, then they could contact the DNR, and maybe the DNR would provide more information on maybe like someone knowledgeable that could come assess the site and maybe make recommendations if they're really serious about protecting this population.
I don't I guess I'll ask, not sure, I asked Tony about that, whether the DNR would have the ability to come out and assess the site, or
Unfortunately, no, we don't have
no.
those resources. So we would point them back to MNFI for a
Mhm.
consultation.
Okay.
So they could potentially pay MNFI to come out and consult, but that's probably the best source right now. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So there's an
Yep.
avenue um, to potentially protect your population there. Right. So maybe that is all the time we have for questions today. It is 11:30. If you are part of an organization that might be willing to support monitoring efforts or surveys, I would go ahead and give you man an email and let her know. And I guess if you have any questions that really need to be answered, Yuman, would it be okay if folks contacted you?
Sure. Mhm.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you all so much for attending the webinar today. Thank you, Yuman, for presenting and Tony for hosting. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. We appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.